Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto was adopted sealed master and built ultimate harem with massive girls of Konoha, Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now start a fanfic. 5-year-old Uzumaki Naruto was having a nightmare. This was nothing unusual considering his life. The orphanage where he lived was staffed with caretakers who hated him and made sure to make his life as miserable as possible, which included rewarding the other children for bullying him. Before the nightmare could progress very far though, it changed. He felt a comforting warmth and saw an image of a woman with dusk-colored skin and slitted crimson eyes and equally crimson hair. She possessed a beauty that no mortal woman could ever hope to approach. In the dream she was holding the small boy and stroking his hair comfortingly, murmuring soft words in his ear and he relaxed, nightmare long forgotten. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. 7-year-old Uzumaki Naruto was cold, wet and hungry. This was nothing new for him, as people would often refuse to sell him food. Naruto knew that the small amount of food he managed to get was not nearly enough, but he somehow managed to survive without looking malnourished. He was cold and wet because of the rain and had nowhere to take shelter, so he was just aimlessly wandering the streets, hoping to find somewhere where he could wait for the rain to stop. He saw a ramen stand that had a delicious smell coming from it and decided to risk going inside, hoping that he wouldn't be thrown out like everywhere else. He sat on one of the stools and sighed in relief at being out of the rain and being able to rest his aching feet. "What would you like?" a middle-aged man asked, looking at him with clear recognition of who he was. "Is it okay if I just sit here for a while?" the small blonde asked, hoping that he wouldn't get yelled at if he didn't order anything. "You sure you don't want anything?" Ichiraku Tsuki asked, looking a bit concerned, since the boy looked about ready to collapse. "Yeah, I'm not really hungry," Naruto said, but was betrayed by the pitiful growling of his stomach, making him look down at his feet in embarrassment. "Doesn't sound like it to me. You just wait right there, kid, I'll get you something to eat," Tsuki declared. "I don't have any money," Naruto muttered, trying not to sound sad. He had learned early on that people either got angry or made fun of him if he was sad. "It's okay kid, it's on the house today," Tsuki responded. It went against good business sense to give away free food, but looking at the small blonde who looked like he hadn't smiled once in his entire life and clearly hadn't eaten in days, he couldn't bring himself to do anything else. The hesitant smile on his face confirmed his decision as being the right one. A few minutes later, a girl that looked about 11 years old set down a ramen bowl in front of Naruto, the smell of the food already making him salivate. "Hi, I'm Ayame, what's your name?" she asked with a smile. Returning the smile with an unfamiliar smile of his own, he responded, "Naruto." "Nice to meet you Naruto. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. 9-year-old Uzumaki Naruto was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from the vicious beating that he had endured not too long ago. He had been caught stealing and his intended victims had taken it as an excuse to beat him half to death. It was painful, but he was going to do it again, because he simply didn't have any choice. He was charged triple the usual price for everything and the small stipend for orphans that he got from the village wasn't enough to pay for everything that he needed to survive. Above him was standing a nurse with an angry, hateful expression on her face, holding a syringe. Her mouth twisted into a smirk as she injected the contents of the syringe into his arm, certain that the demon who had taken her husband from her would finally die. When she left the room, the small blonde boy had already begun to burn with a fever as his body tried to fight off the aggressive foreign substance. Coupled with his injuries, he should have been too weak to survive the damage on his body, but a sudden rush of familiar warmth through his body gave him the strength to pull through. When he woke up the next day, fully healed, all he could remember was being held and feeling safe. There had been a few locks of deep crimson hair hanging in front of his face, and an enchantingly beautiful voice had been humming something in his ear. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. 10-year-old Uzumaki Naruto was shivering in his small apartment. He was the only one that lived in the building, all the other tenants having moved out, not wanting to live in the same building as the demon. It was the dead of winter and he had no heating. To make it worse, someone had thrown a rock through his window, so it was almost as cold inside as it was outside. He would have moved to another apartment in the building, but all of them had broken windows. He was just thinking of what he could do to get warm when a sudden warmth rushed through his body and he fell unconscious. When he opened his eyes next, he was standing in front of a comfortable-looking cabin in the middle of a forest, with a large rock next to it. There was a piece of paper stuck to the rock, but he didn't pay attention to that now. Having nothing better to do, he went up to the door and knocked, not really expecting anyone to be inside. When he heard someone moving inside, he became nervous and almost ran away, but in the end decided not to. The door opened and his breath caught in his throat at what he saw. A woman of such impossible beauty that she couldn't possibly be human, with slitted crimson eyes and hair so red it looked to be on fire when it caught the light. Her skin had an alluring dusky tan and her perfect body was covered by a short black and red yukata that revealed a generous amount of cleavage and left her legs bare. More to the point, he recognized this woman. He had seen her in his dreams many times. "It's you," he whispered in amazement and longing. "Oh, you remember me?" she asked, leaning on the doorframe, and Naruto trembled at hearing the familiar enchanting voice that had comforted him so many nights when all the world seemed so cruel and hateful. Without thinking, he moved towards her and hugged her around the waist. "You've taken care of me for as long as I can remember, of course I remember you," he choked out, trying to hold back tears that he could finally talk to her. "I wonder if you would still think so if you knew who I was," she said to herself after she got over the surprise at being hugged like that. "My name's Naruto, who are you?" he asked as politely as possible, not wanting to offend her. "You may call me Zana. I am the Kyuubi," the now named Zana told him. Naruto had just now noticed the 9 red-orange fox tails swaying behind her. He had heard of the Kyuubi. It was said to be a gigantic evil fox with 9 tails that had attacked the village 10 years ago. Zana had said that she was the Kyuubi and she had 9 fox tails, but she was the nicest person he had ever met. To him this could only mean that the village had done something to make her angry, since there was no way that someone as nice as her could have attacked for no reason. To him the villagers had always been cruel and evil people, so to him it made sense that they could have done something to make her attack. "Did they do something to you to make you angry?" he asked cautiously. Zana started in surprise, having expected him to jump back in panic instead of asking a question that was surprisingly close to the truth. Once she had composed herself, she picked the boy up and carried him over to her bed and laid down with him. Naruto felt happier than he could ever remember being. If he could, he would have stayed in her arms for the rest of eternity. "In a way they did do something," she said, and Naruto turned towards her, giving her his full attention. "I am drawn towards places where there are large amounts of human malice and corruption. I sensed it in Konaha came deliver a warning that if people do not change, I will destroy it. Before I could speak a word, they attacked me and I fought back. If that Yondaime Hokage of yours hadn't been insane enough to summon the death god, then I would have destroyed the village for daring to attack me. So you were just going to tell them to be better people and they attacked you?" Naruto asked in shock. "Yes, and now they hate you because I am sealed inside you." Naruto spent a while contemplating this information as the Kyuubi watched on curiously, waiting to see how he would react. She was expecting him to push away from her and start shouting accusations at her, but he proved to be a rather unpredictable human. "Well, I'm glad that you're with me. I want to stay with you forever. Will you marry me?" He didn't really know what it meant that she was sealed inside him, nor did he truly understand what marriage was, since he had nobody to explain it to him, but he knew that married people were supposed to stay together forever, which was what he wanted. Xana stared at him incredulously, before an uncontrollable laugh bubbled out of her at the fact that she had just been proposed to by her 10-year-old container. Oh, Naruto, ha 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 ha, you are something else. Finally bringing her laughing under control, she continued. The fact that I am sealed into you by the power of the death god means that we are going to be together for quite a while. As for marrying you, well, I could only marry someone who was my equal and you aren't. Naruto looked crestfallen for a moment before a fiercely determined expression crossed his face. Then I'll become your equal. Even if it takes me the rest of my life, I'll do whatever I have to, but I'll become your equal and then I'll marry you. I promise I'll never give up, you can count on it. He declared. Xana just smiled at him in bemusement, but she could see that this meant a lot to him and she wasn't going to crush his hopes. Besides, his desire to be strong would only help him in life, even if it was for a rather odd reason. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Naruto's apartment, intending to make him some of her special comfort ramen that he liked to eat when he was upset. The blonde had just failed his genin exam the previous day and was a bit upset about it. Naruto lived in the bad part of town and it would usually be a very bad idea for a young woman to be walking in that part of town alone, but it had been a while since that had been the case. Thugs from the local criminal gangs had sometimes come to extort Prt1 money from her father a few years ago, but suddenly that had stopped. She didn't know why, but she was grateful for it. Naruto had also assured her that she was perfectly safe in these parts, and so far he had been right. What she didn't know was that several of the local criminals were keeping an eye on her. Contrary to what people might think if they were aware of this, it wasn't because they had any intention of stealing from her or anything worse. It was in fact to keep her safe. They knew that nobody in this part of town would dare lay a hand on the pretty ramen waitress, but in this case it paid to be extra careful, as there would be hell to pay if a single hair on her head was hurt. Uzumaki Naruto had needed to turn to crime years ago to make ends meet and had caught sight of several thugs extorting money from the Ichirakus, who were the only people in the village that he cared for. After meeting Xana and making his promise to become her equal so that he was worthy of her hand in marriage, he had thrown himself into a near-suicidal training regime that left him exhausted every day. This had left him needing more money, which had left him no choice but to delve deeper into the criminal underworld. Within a few years he had seized control of nearly all of it, despite being only 13 years old. The criminals in Konaha had quickly discovered that a determined 13-year-old with ninja training, who had incidentally needed to be cunning enough to survive in a village that hated him, was a lot more dangerous than he looked. One of the last criminal leaders to have fallen to Naruto's campaign had the idea to threaten that he was going to kidnap Ayame and turn her into a whore for his men. People still shuddered whenever they thought about what the blonde had done to the man. By now the criminals in the village had developed enough of a self-preservation instinct to realize that it was a bad idea to poke at a sleeping dragon. Many of them believed that Naruto was in fact the Kyuubi in human form, but they were smart enough to realize that if this was true, then it was stupid as hell to make him angry, which was something that the rest of the village hadn't learned yet. The shinobi still thought themselves above him and didn't consider him a threat, so they threw insults at him whenever they saw him, and the civilians didn't think that he would fight back, since he hadn't before. They were quite wrong on that count, as Naruto had turned the activities of the criminals towards the very people who thought that they could get away with abusing him. It had been subtle at first, but they were starting to feel the sting of planned thefts, blackmail, extortion and various other crimes. One thing that was not tolerated, however, was rape, and anyone that committed that particular offense rapidly found himself hunted down and killed in various painful ways. All of this was the reason why the criminal underworld was being protective of the Ichirakus in general and Ayame in particular. They knew that if any harm came to them, Naruto would go through them like a harvester looking for whoever was responsible. All in all though, things had actually improved for them. The blonde demon container might have been young, but he was clever beyond his years and kept things running smoothly. Crazies such as serial killers and rapists were disposed of quickly so that they didn't cause trouble and draw unnecessary attention. The ninja were kept off their back due to them keeping a low profile, and Naruto wasn't a greedy fool like many other criminal leaders. He only kept what money he needed and invested the rest back into the system to keep things running, and he took his responsibility as a leader seriously, which got him a great deal of respect and loyalty, so there was barely any need to keep an eye out for anyone stepping out of line. But he was still scary as hell when he got angry, which was why Ayame always had a hidden escort. Their ramen stand also got a lot of business from people that were honestly loyal to the blonde and wanted to make certain that the girl he cherished so much was kept safe. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX He came inside the seal often, always eager to see the red-haired demoness that he had sworn he would marry one day. The past 5 years he had pushed himself hard without a single day's break, the regeneration that having the Kyuubi sealed into him granted, making certain that he didn't damage himself permanently. He had tried to learn absolutely everything that would make him stronger, which unfortunately wasn't a whole lot. Apparently shinobi techniques weren't just kept in the public library for all to read, though he did manage to learn some things, such as some chakra control exercises and fuinjutsu. Naruto figured that the only reason he had been able to get his hands on any fuinjutsu books was because it was a dying art. Fuinjutsu had proven a particularly difficult subject, but ever since he had learned the shadow clone technique 2 years ago, things had picked up. Truly, the day that Mizuki had thought to use him as a scapegoat for stealing the scroll of forbidden seals had been a lucky break. After he had figured out the secret of the shadow clone memory transfer, he had been able to get a bit reckless with his fuinjutsu experiments without the risk of blasting himself into atomic vapor. He was still failing the academy every year due to one bullshit reason or another that the biased academy instructors made up, but he knew that they wouldn't be able to keep it up forever. It didn't matter anyway, he was getting stronger every day and there was nothing that they could do to stop that, just like it didn't matter that they deliberately edited his scores in such a way that he ended up being the dead last every time. "Good evening, Naruto, did you miss me?" Xana asked with a teasing smile as she appeared behind him and settled her hands on his shoulders. He wasn't as small as he used to be, but he wasn't quite as tall as her yet, though his body was showing the muscle that his harsh training was giving him. "Always, Xana." Naruto sighed out happily at being close to her again. "Have you been training yourself to exhaustion again?" "Yeah, but I really need to get out of the academy, or else I'm gonna be stuck just because I don't have access to any new techniques," Naruto complained. "Well, I can't help you with that, though I think I may be able to tell you who your parents were," Xana stated. She had considered whether to tell him or not and whether her guess was even correct, but in the end she was fairly certain it was. Besides, it's not like telling him about his parents or about some of their abilities was going to hurt her in the long run. If Naruto had turned out to be angry at her all those years ago, she wouldn't have told him, as he might have used that knowledge against her sometime in the future, but as things stood now, he would likely do anything that she asked of him. "Really? How did you manage to find out?" Naruto asked curiously. He wasn't as desperate to know about his parents as he would have been in the past, but it would still be nice to know. "Based on the feel of your chakra and the way you look, I would say that you are the son of the Yondaime Hokage and a red-haired kunoichi that fought me that night." Naruto stared at her in shock. He definitely hadn't been expecting that. "The Yondaime? So that means that he sacrificed his own son to seal you. And what about my mother? Do you know her name?" Naruto asked in a rush. Xana glared at him for the stupid question. "Of course I don't know her name, Naruto. We didn't exactly introduce ourselves before we fought. All I know is that she had red hair and her chakra felt similar to you." She seemed to be able to form chains out of her chakra. The chains were remarkably strong, so it might have been a bloodline ability. Naruto looked a bit sheepish for a second before looking intrigued. If a being as powerful as the Kyuubi said that those chains were strong, then it was worth looking into. How was our chakra similar? Well, it feels dense, for lack of a better term, as if it were more compressed than most people's chakra. Did my father use any interesting abilities? He asked with restrained excitement, already thinking of ways to reproduce the chains and any other powerful techniques he could hear about. Well, aside from that teleporting trick of his and the Reaper Death Seal, he made these spinning spheres made of pure chakra. She told him. Awesome, thanks a lot, Xana. This is going to go a long way towards making me strong enough to marry you. Are you still determined to achieve that? She asked him in amusement. Of course, I love you and I want you to acknowledge me as being worthy of you. Naruto declared firmly, while the Kyuubi stared at him in some surprise, as this was the first time that he had stated that he loved her. You love me. Don't you realize that you have very little chance to ever match my power? Wouldn't it be more sensible to turn your interests towards a human girl? Even I don't know of any way to make you that powerful. She tried to reason with him awkwardly. This was very much new territory to her. Nobody had ever declared their love for her and she had never really considered it, but she did genuinely like the blonde teenager and didn't wish to see him spending his life in pursuit of a goal that might well be impossible. It doesn't matter how little chance there is, I'll find a way to do it. Besides, you're the only woman I could ever love like that. You soothed me when I couldn't sleep, you healed me when I was hurt, you kept me warm in the winters and have always been here for me. Just for all that I would have always loved you, but I've come to know you as a person these past 5 years and fell in love with you as a woman. It doesn't matter if it takes me my entire life, but I will find a way to become as strong as you and hope that you will accept me as your husband. I'm willing to do anything for that. Anything you say. Then how about letting me out of this seal? Xana asked sardonically, knowing that he wasn't going to do that. You mean I could have released you at any time? Naruto asked incredulously. Xana looked at him in surprise, having thought that he knew that. Well, of course. What did you think that paper with seal written on it was? You mean the one on the rock over there? Naruto questioned. That's the one, she answered with an amused tone. All I have to do is rip it off, right? He asked as he began to move towards it. Wait, you mean you're actually going to do it? You do realize that's going to kill you, right? She asked in surprise. She knew that the blonde cared for her, but she didn't expect him to be so willing to give up his life to free her. Actually, I didn't know that, he admitted. But it doesn't matter. You've done a lot for me over the years and I don't mind giving up my life for your freedom. Xana could not contain her laughter at his words. Oh Naruto, you truly are something else, to be so fearlessly willing to give your life for my freedom, despite the fact that I had intended to destroy your village when you were born. Yeah, about that. Could you make sure that you don't hurt old man Tuki and Ayame? They're good people. Oh, you would ask me to spare only them. I thought that you would ask me not to attack the village in exchange for my freedom. Well, from what I've seen from most of the village, it deserves to be attacked and those two are the only ones I know of that are truly decent people. You needn't worry, Naruto, I won't even immediately destroy the village. Even if I hadn't been sealed inside you, you would have been an old man before I returned to destroy the village if they hadn't changed their ways. Also, if you release me from this seal, I think that I can leave your body without killing you, though it will be painful for you. Xana stated after a moment of consideration. Getting her freedom would be wonderful, but she honestly couldn't bring herself to heartlessly kill this brave and pure-hearted young man. It was ironic that he more than anyone else in the village had the will of fire that they so liked to talk about and nobody saw it. Senju Hashirama had been a similar man with his dream of bringing together various ninja clans and forming a lasting peace. He had ultimately failed, of course, and the village he had created had become a corrupt shadow of what he had made, but his intentions had been pure. Well, he could have had the will of fire at least. The hatred of the villagers had made sure that he was unable to feel any true loyalty to the village itself. Instead, he cared only for those few people that he was close to and had closed his heart to everyone else. Then there really is no more reason to put this off. You really should have told me about this years ago. I would have been glad to free you as soon as possible. Naruto commented as he moved towards the seal and ripped it off without another thought. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. 17-year-old Uzumaki Naruto, along with his 13-year-old teammates Uchiha Sasuke and Haruno Sakura, was waiting for his assigned sensei to show up. He had already decided that he disliked the man for making him waste 3 hours of his day by being late. To Naruto, his time was important to him. How was he supposed to ever become strong enough to marry the woman he loved above all others if he wasted time? The new Chunin teacher, Yumino Iruka, had apparently decided that Naruto was not in fact the reincarnation of the demon fox and had passed him. Naruto would have been inclined to get to know the man if he hadn't been one of those who had deliberately failed him the previous year. He had still ended up being the dead last, despite the fact that he never lost a spar, or the fact that his written tests were in fact fairly decent. Whatever had caused Iruka to finally see the light did not extend to the other instructors, who still made sure to edit his scores so that they were the worst in the class by a long shot. 7 years had passed now since he had declared that he would marry Xana, and he had devoted nearly every waking moment to this goal. He hadn't been able to get his hands on any jutsu, but he had long since realized that no matter how many techniques he mastered, it wouldn't mean anything at all. Mere mortal techniques would never match the power that the great demoness wielded in her pinky finger. Fuinjutsu had shown itself to be promising, but he knew that while it had impressive potential, Xana would not respect his strength just because he could seal her away. She would only consider him an equal if he could match her in open combat. No mortal had ever considered such a thing. To become powerful enough to challenge the mighty Kyuubi. It was madness. Even the most powerful shinobi would have trouble with the weakest of the Biju, at least without some kind of special advantage, let alone the strongest of them. But Naruto didn't care how insane it sounded. If nobody else had the courage to try such a thing, then that was their own problem. To become powerful enough to gain her respect and become worthy of hand in marriage was his only ambition, and if he died trying, then he was clearly unworthy of her to begin with. To reach his dream, he had tried to develop his abilities in a different direction than most shinobi would think of. With the knowledge that Xana had been kind enough to give to him regarding his parents, he had gotten several ideas. He had learned that the spinning chakra orb that she had mentioned was called the Rasengan, and it was one of his father's most well-known techniques, though there had been predictably no information on how to learn it. He hadn't let himself be stopped by that, however, and had done his best to learn it anyway. So far he had no luck with it, though there had been some results. He knew that there had to be some trick to it, but it had eluded him so far. He could make an orb just fine, but it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. From what Xana had told him, the Rasengan should grind away at anything that it touched. His attempts so far did not do any grinding, and no amount of chakra that he poured into it would force it to. Instead of scratching his head in confusion, he had instead tried to shape the Rasengan into a sharp, piercing drill around his hand. That had yielded some success, though he suspected this was only because of the dense chakra that he had. He had named this variation the Rasenyari, spiraling spear, and had decided to leave the Rasengan alone until he got some new ideas. His other project was to figure out if he could manifest the same chakra chains that his mother had used. At least both he and Xana were fairly sure that she had been his mother. There had been no way to make certain aside from the similar feel of his chakra. He had only managed to gather a few scattered mentions of an Uzumaki clan, but he very much suspected that it had been a clan of some importance. That suspicion was confirmed only about a year ago when he had finally manifested a single chain. After that, he had been extremely careful to keep that ability hidden, as he could only come to the conclusion that the Hokage was deliberately hiding the knowledge of his clan from him and he didn't want to draw attention to himself right now. Ironically, it had been only when he had released Xana from the seal that he had become capable of creating the chakra chains. It had taken nearly a full week for Xana to leave his body safely, during which he could do nothing but stay still on his bed and endure the pain of having his chakra coils strained to the breaking point. The regenerative healing factor that her presence in her body had granted was the only reason he was even able to survive the ordeal, as his coils had been suffering damage constantly. Xana had made sure to leave his body only as fast as he could handle, but she had also gone as fast as possible without causing him permanent damage. If she had tried to leave him without causing him pain, then it would have taken decades and neither one of them was that patient. When it was finally over, they had discovered an unforeseen benefit to the painful experience. Due to the constant strain on his coils, they had expanded massively and his chakra reserves had increased proportionally as well as becoming even denser. Apparently it took a certain density of chakra to form the chains, which was why all previous attempts had failed. Naruto had been more glad than ever that he had decided to release the demoness. Aside from this, he had managed to get his hands on some affinity paper and discovered his affinities to be wind and water, but he had once again been unable to really do anything with that knowledge. His most interesting success though had been in the manipulation of raw chakra as a means of enhancing the body. He had swiftly discovered that channeling chakra to his body would make the bones harder and the muscles stronger, which he guessed was the reason that most shinobi looked way too skinny to have any kind of power in their bodies. He had resolved to never use chakra to enhance his muscles during training, as he definitely did not want to rely on chakra enhancement to solve all his problems, nor did he want to look like a skinny twig. None of that was anything special, however, as just about every shinobi enhanced their bodies with chakra. What had intrigued Naruto had been the discovery that he could lace his vocal cords with chakra, which empowered his words in a way that he was almost certain nobody had ever considered before. When he spoke with a chakra-empowered voice, he was actually casting a very subtle genjutsu on anyone that heard him. So subtle in fact that it was damn near undetectable. He wasn't sure if it had any combat application, but it made him incredibly persuasive as long as nobody realized what was going on, which was why he guarded the secret of this ability above all else and only used it when he absolutely needed someone to believe his words. He knew that it was unlikely that this ability would be discovered considering the fact that it didn't rely on injecting his own chakra into the target the way regular genjutsu did, but there was no sense in taking risks. According to Xana, this was an ability that all the Biju had to some degree. She speculated that Naruto had developed it because his body was practically saturated with his incredibly dense chakra, which allowed him to channel it in ways that other humans simply weren't capable of. He was actually glad that his titanic chakra reserves compared to other humans at least made him unable to use genjutsu the normal way, as it would automatically make people think that he could not possibly use genjutsu in such an underhanded way. Fuinjutsu had proven itself to be highly useful for muscle training. Resistance seals that put equal strain on his entire body had sculpted his body into something that was entirely impossible to achieve with any kind of regular training, especially as it seemed that he had kept the healing factor despite no longer having Xana sealed inside him. Apparently his body had gotten used to operating with a very fast healing ability, though the healing ability had a hefty cost in chakra. Fortunately, he had so much chakra now that he would only notice the drain in a protracted battle. All of these achievements gave him hope that his goal was achievable, no matter how difficult, but what made him happy was the fact that Xana often came to visit him. She didn't stay with him all the time, and whenever he had asked where she went, she only smiled mysteriously, but he still saw her often. Sometimes she would stay at his home, which was now rather nice due to the fact that he was in control of practically the entire red light district and the rest of the darker parts of the village, but most of the time she was somewhere else. The mighty demoness had discovered that she enjoyed cuddling now that she had someone that she felt was better than the rest of the mortal sheep as she called them. That had also led to him losing his virginity to her one night when he was 16. Flashback. Naruto was in his happy place again. Xana had come to visit after a longer than average absence and they were in bed together, with the beautiful red-haired demoness spooned up against him. At 16 years old, Naruto was at a rather tall 6-foot teenager. The blonde was quite pleased with this, as Xana herself was just as tall as him and he would have been quite embarrassed if he had ended up being a short little shrimp and Xana would have towered over him. He was infinitely glad that he had devoted some time to carefully regulate his food intake for maximum benefit to his growth, with only the occasional bowl of ramen as a treat. He still visited the Ichiraku stand, but he usually ordered something healthy or sometimes just to visit a Yame and Tuki. Being tall in this instance, however, presented a particular problem. Namely, Xana had her posterior pressed against his underwear-clad crotch and his right hand trapped between her very shapely and firm borderline D cup. She outright refused to wear anything to bed and even demanded that he not wear anything except a pair of underwear, because she enjoyed the feel of skin-on-skin contact too much. This was a frequent problem for Naruto, and he actually liked this problem if he were honest with himself, but tonight it was especially bad. Xana had been gone for a whole month and had apparently missed the cuddling just as much as him, which was why she was now slowly grinding her, in Naruto's opinion, incredibly against his crotch, and it was driving him mad. He had some suspicions that she liked the reactions she got out of him and did this kind of thing on purpose. He wouldn't dare make any kind of advance on her, but with one hand between her and the way that she was rubbing herself against him, Naruto feared that he would very soon have a sticky mess in his underwear. Just as he thought that the situation couldn't become any more unbearable, her constant rubbing managed to undo the buttons on his underwear, causing his rock-hard, 8-inch rod to spring out of its confines and slap directly into her nether regions, causing her to gasp out in surprise. It was the thing that Naruto had ever heard, and he couldn't stop himself from giving out a deep groan of pleasure, desire and frustration. After a long moment, Xana turned around and pushed him onto his back so that she was lying on top of him with her pushing into his muscled chest, making sure to keep his rod trapped between her legs the entire time. Naruto was half expecting her to rip his throat out for what had happened, even if it was technically her own fault, but he was still enjoying himself immensely. In spite of the possibly lethal situation if she decided to take offense, he was still a healthy teenager who was in a very intimate situation with a woman that had occupied his thoughts every single day. He had been lusting after her ever since he was 11 when puberty had kicked in, and he couldn't really say that he regretted the current situation even if she was angry at him. "Are you still determined to marry me, Naruto?" she asked, not sounding upset at all. Naruto managed to find enough blood in his brain to form an answer. "More than ever. With every day I love you more. I'm going to become as strong as you one day and earn the right to marry you," he stated firmly, fully believing every word. Naruto felt her clench her thighs together around him at his words and felt something wet trickle down his erect member. It was taking every bit of restraint he had to keep still at this point, even as he suddenly understood that she had been testing him with both her actions and her question just now. She had done this several times before, even before he had released her from the seal. Sometimes she would do something or tell him something about herself and would then ask him whether he still intended to marry her. Often what she told him would make an average person consider her evil or monstrous, but he could never see her that way. He didn't try to rationalize her actions, but no matter what she told him, it could never taint his opinion of her. She wasn't human. He fully understood that, and there was absolutely no point in attempting to judge her as one. Aside from that, he would have been nothing without her. Even if she decided one day that she wanted to kill him, he would still love her. He had after all been prepared to die just so that he could release her from an imprisonment that he considered unjust. "You've impressed me a great deal in the past few years, Naruto, and I think that you deserve a reward," she whispered to him in a voice that nearly made him lose it all over again, slitted crimson eyes burning into him. What kind of reward?" he managed to ask with a hoarse stutter, self-control evaporating like a glass of water spilled over a hot metal surface. Naruto dimly realized that his hands had somehow ended up on her waist, but he didn't remember putting them there. Her eyes still firmly fixed on his, she moved one of her hands to rip off his underwear and then grab hold of the rock-hard rod of flesh that was still held between her thighs and grabbed it, making him suck in a short breath and then groan as she guided him inside her. This reward. Naruto was entirely incapable of speech as she raised herself up to straddle him and began moving, riding him slowly. Seeing her bouncing as she moved, his hands reached up to touch them, barely able to believe that this was really happening. He grabbed them gently at first, but quickly started squeezing harder as his lust fogged up his mind. When he felt her hands covering his own, he was suddenly seized by a desire to kiss her and lifted himself up, inadvertently thrusting deeper inside her, making her let out a short gasp. He moved his right hand behind her head and brought her lips down on his own. He sought out her tongue greedily, making her give out a surprised moan as his left hand lowered itself to the small of her back and began pushing her onto his member more forcefully. This being Naruto's first time, the sensory overload quickly caused him to reach his climax inside of her, leaving him gasping for breath, as the orgasm had practically ambushed him. When the feeling faded enough to let him think, he became embarrassed by just how quickly she had driven him over the edge. Looking up at her, he was relieved that she only had a small smile on her face instead of looking upset. He loved it when she smiled at him, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and before he knew it, he was hard again, still inside of her. Xana let out a surprised gasp as she found herself flipped onto her back, with Naruto pressing down on her. Before she could say anything, he began thrusting into her and claiming her lips in another kiss. As he kept thrusting into her, he distantly remembered that she had told him that immortal beings such as her were unable to conceive children, something about preserving balance that he really wasn't able to care about right now. Naruto lasted longer this time, but he still emptied himself into her without Xana reaching a climax of her own. As he collapsed onto her, she began stroking his sweaty back and down towards his butt. Naruto began to gently kiss her neck and ear, which earned him a purring noise and a grope of his rear end. Aside from enjoying kissing her neck, he had also been using it as an excuse to hide his embarrassed blush at the fact that he had pretty much lost control and kept thrusting into her until he had climaxed, barely able to think of anything else. Unseen by him, the demoness herself had a mischievous grin on her face. She had fully expected that he would be rather clumsy and overeager during his first time, but there would be plenty of time for him to learn how to please her. Even if he never reached his lofty goal of equaling her power, she had taken a genuine liking to him and intended to enjoy her time with him for as long as he lived. When she felt him getting hard again in response to her ministrations, she gave another grin and flipped him over again. Maybe she'd even tell him one day that she'd done some adjusting to his body over the years before he'd released her. The Yondaime may have contracted the death god to seal her inside Naruto, but nothing in the contract had said anything about preventing her from influencing his body as long as her power didn't leave his body. Overall, she figured that the blonde would be pleased rather than upset over the fact that she had made sure that he would be taller and that his equipment would be larger. The stamina and endurance was entirely his own, however, though once boosted by her presence inside him, now it relied on his own strength. Grabbing his hands in both of hers, she leaned over him as she began to grind on his once again erect member, not bothered at all by the slow leaking from his previous two releases. Naruto tried to free his hands from her grip and touch that dangled so enticingly in front of him, but found her grip to be well beyond his ability to break. He found himself strangely turned on by the fact that he was being held down by the demoness and unable to break free of her grip as she rode him. Xana, however, did notice that his eyes strayed towards her constantly as he tried to break her grip and deliberately leaned over so that her right nipple was just in front of his face. Naruto stared at the perfect dark pink nipple that sat on a perfect dusky skin with a nearly hypnotized look for a long 2 seconds before he raised his head and took it into his mouth. He licked and sucked on it gently at first, making Xana give an appreciative moan before he pulled on it more insistently, making her lean further down when his neck began protesting the awkward position. Gently. Xana chided softly. Naruto looked into her eyes again, before nodding and taking her nipple into his mouth again, this time making sure to stay gentle, being endlessly turned on by the sounds of appreciation that she was giving off. Deciding to try something new, he gently scraped his sharper than normal teeth over the sensitive nub, making her gasp out again. Fearing that he'd screwed up, he looked up at her face again and was relieved to see that she looked pleased. Feeling more confident now, he returned his attention to the nipple, alternating between licking, sucking and using his teeth. He was so focused on what he was doing and the ever-rising pleasure of having her ride him, that he nearly missed the fact that her breathing had become heavier. The nipple was suddenly removed from his mouth and he wanted to protest, but was quickly silenced by the fact that he had the other one deposited into his mouth. He felt himself nearing another orgasm, and was unable to do anything to prolong it between her clenching nether lips, the panting in his enjoyment of pleasuring her. With a short and muffled scream, her vaginal lips gripped him harder than ever, making him spill his seed inside her for the third time, this time feeling satisfied that she had climaxed alongside him. They spent the next several minutes just cuddling in silence, with Xana lying on top of him and Naruto slowly running his fingers down her back, making her give off an occasional delighted shiver at the pleasant sensation. "You know I'm going to expect you to get better at this, don't you?" Xana said lazily. Naruto couldn't help but grin at her brutal honesty, delivered with all the grace and subtlety of a warhammer. He had always liked having the truth delivered raw and without any attempt to spare his feelings. At least he had done better in the third round, though he had to admit that most of that had been thanks to her. "Then you'll have to help me practice a lot," he returned, grin still on his face. He was in fact looking forward to practicing. "I'll be sure to do that occasionally, but I meant that I want you to practice with other women," she said with a smile, knowing that this was one thing about her that was going to shock him no matter how incredibly accepting he had been of her demonic nature so far. And indeed she was right, as the blonde was looking quite poleaxed, not having expected such a thing in the slightest. He had spent quite a lot of time thinking about what kind of differences there might be between a human woman and a demonic one. He had considered the possibility that she may not care if he slept with other women, but he hadn't actually intended to do it whether she cared or not. To hear that she wanted him to actively seek out other women and sleep with them had been so unexpected that it left him unable to process the situation for nearly a whole minute. Xana patiently waited for him to get his wits together, sporting a shit-eating grin the entire time. She did so love messing with him. Most of the time the blonde was so focused that it always amused her to see him shocked. "Let me get this straight. You want me to go out and find women to have with so that I'll get better at it?" Naruto asked, just to be sure that he was hearing things right. "Yes," was the simple answer. "I won't even bother asking why since you've already said you want me to get better," Naruto said slowly, making her grin again at his understanding. Demons in general were not fond of stupid questions and she had indeed stated her reasons already. "I can't say that I am entirely comfortable with this. It was always my intention to be completely dedicated to you." Xana had to smile at the sweet, but so very human sentiment. "You have already dedicated your life to pursuing me as your wife, have you not?" she asked. "Of course. And I assume that you will not allow yourself to be swayed from this course." "No way, you're the only one I could ever want as my wife." "Well then I expect you to practice your technique instead of relying on the impressive size of your tool," she told him firmly. Naruto flushed at her wording, but he knew that it would be a bad idea to try and talk her out of this. Her tone told him that she was serious about this and she would more than likely be upset with him if he argued. Her frequent visits were the happiest part of his life, and he definitely didn't want her to disappear just because he was being stubborn and trying to apply the human concept of loyalty to a demon. To her, it would no doubt be an insult if he didn't try to better himself for her sake. With a sigh, Naruto let go of his reservations about the situation. Alright, I'll seek out other women to practice on. Truth be told, he wasn't comfortable thinking of other women as practice material, so he intended to explain the bizarre, to humans, situation and let the women decide if they wanted to go along with it. Good, and remember that the lowest circle of hell is reserved for oath breakers. Xana said with a smile that was suddenly very sinister, showing just the tips of sharp fangs, and the blonde was quick to nod his agreement. Naruto got the distinct feeling that the ominous statement was also intended to remind him that he had not only agreed to practice, but that he had sworn to be hers alone. Despite the threatening nature of the statement, Naruto was actually happy about it, because it revealed that she would be upset if he settled for a human woman. That meant that she had grown to care for him to some extent, which only bolstered his determination to continue growing stronger as his dreams seemed to be tangibly closer. Xana smiled at his understanding. She had never met or heard of a human that had attempted to understand and accept the nature of demons to this extent. He had never been bothered by the fact that she felt no remorse for killing humans or the bloodlust that sometimes gripped her during the killing. It was actually quite amusing that the only thing to have given him pause so far was her attitude towards. Even when she had told him that if she should happen to kill innocent bystanders during her rampages, she would still feel no remorse over it. Instead of being horrified like most humans would, he had simply thought it over for a few minutes before concluding that she would likely consider it their own fault for not getting out of the way, and he had been right. After he had gotten over the why, Naruto had spent a whole week agonizing over the how of finding women to practice on. At long last he had decided to swallow his embarrassment and headed towards the nearest brothel, deducing that the women there would no doubt have plenty of experience in such matters. He had sought out the oldest of the prostitutes there, a still beautiful woman in her mid-30s, and explained his situation with a great deal of embarrassment. She had quite clearly not believed him at first, and he really couldn't blame her, as he had given her a highly edited version of the truth that made no mention of demonic future wives. Fortunately, she had agreed to help either way and had even eventually believed him, as he had kept insisting that it was the truth. Unknown to Naruto, the woman in question had known exactly who he was and knew that he was the reason that rape had been all but stamped out. Despite all efforts at secrecy, word had gone around that he was in fact the one who was in control of all the shady elements in that part of town. People had been dubious about having someone so young in charge, but after seeing how well he had things in hand, true loyalty had appeared and everyone kept their mouth firmly shut so that nobody would meddle and ruin it for them. Also unknown to Naruto was the fact that his strict no-tolerance policy towards any kind of mistreatment towards women, no matter who they were, had made him an item of interest among the girls working in the brothels, especially after seeing how handsome he had turned out to be. This was the reason that a confused Naruto was one day directed towards a much younger and eager-looking girl by the older, more experienced woman. It wasn't long before the blonde was being passed from one girl to another every time he came looking for practice. The story that the woman he loved and whose favor he was trying to gain by practicing his technique, as she put it, had only made the girls more enthusiastic for reasons that continued to escape him. He had also once chanced upon the idea of using a shadow clone when 3 girls hadn't been able to decide which one went first and had instead just decided to share. Within 2 days, all the girls had known about the newly renamed gangbang no jutsu, and were even more determined to get into his pants. Naruto had been pretty incredulous at the fact that a B-rank kinjutsu had been reduced to being a glorified toy, but he couldn't deny that he had certainly been learning a lot about how to please a woman, even if he did sometimes feel like he was having with the entire red light district simultaneously. An interesting little side note had been that he had learned that apparently channeling chakra to his genitals improved the entire experience and turned his ejaculate into some kind of super delicious energy drink, according to one particularly bubbly 20-year-old. All in all, the whole experience left Naruto feeling like the biggest man whore to have ever walked the elemental nations, and he had never been so glad to have applied that seal to his testicles that prevented him from getting a woman pregnant, but he couldn't deny that he had gotten a lot better at pleasing a woman. His growing ability to rob women of the ability to walk through had given rise to another troublesome situation. They wanted him to come back and give them their Naruto time, as they had taken to calling it, because they had never had such an attentive lover. Xana had been laughing her off the entire time when she saw him getting passed around like a piece of meat. Never being one to forget anyone who helped him out, Naruto had diverted a considerable sum of money towards all the girls who had helped him, which had turned out to be pretty much all of them. After that, there had been a rash of new businesses, shops and restaurants being opened all over Konoha, all of which had Uzumaki Naruto listed as a VIP to all employees, along with a sudden decrease in the number of prostitutes. End of the flashback. Naruto snapped out of his memories just in time to see the one-eyed, silver-haired Junin stick his head into the room. My first impression of you, you're boring. Meet me on the roof in 5 minutes. He drawled lazily. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Hitaki Kakashi closely examined the 3 academy graduates in front of him and immediately noticed that something was off. Uchiha Sasuke was pretty much what he had expected. Dark, broody, antisocial, supposedly the best out of this year's Genin graduates. Haruno Sakura was supposed to be top kunoichi, but from what he could see of her, she was clearly not. Her arms were skinny and completely without muscle definition, and the way she kept glancing at the Uchiha made him think she was a fangirl. Uzumaki Naruto was the biggest surprise of the bunch. He towered over all of them at 6 inches 1 foot, heavily muscled, but not so much that it would slow him down, clearly muscle that was meant for use and not for show. The long, wild blonde hair held in a low ponytail along with the black muscle shirt gave him a somewhat thuggish appearance. The whisker marks on his cheeks along with the fact that some of his teeth were sharper than normal for humans gave him a dangerous, feral air. He supposedly only showed up at the academy to take tests, but otherwise didn't even bother showing up. The academy instructors had for years claimed that he was a useless loser that would never make a good ninja and had pointed towards his many failures to graduate to support this. The assessing, intelligent gleam in his eye was making it hard for Kakashi to believe that. Kakashi was in fact eerily reminded of Minato-sensei, but somehow even more driven and much colder. Somehow Kakashi just knew that the blonde would be the one that he would really need to watch out for. Alright, why don't you tell me something about yourselves? Things such as likes, dislikes, hobbies and dreams. Why don't you go first, sensei, so that we can see how it goes? Sakura asked uncertainly. Sigh. Fine. My name is Hitaki Kakashi. I have things that I like and a few things that I don't. Hobbies. I have hobbies. As for dreams, well, I never really thought about it. The Junin drawled lazily. Your turn, Pinky. He pointed at Sakura. She scowled at the nickname but went on with her introduction anyway. My name is Haruno Sakura. I like, looks at Sasuke and blushes. I hate Ino Pig. And my dream is, looks at Sasuke and giggles. Alright, your turn now, princess. He pointed at Sasuke. Sasuke had already been scowling because of Sakura's introduction, so the nickname didn't really change his facial expression any. I am Uchiha Sasuke. I don't like anything and I dislike almost everything, and my ambition is to kill a certain man and rebuild my clan. While Sakura was busy staring at Sasuke and thinking how cool he was, Kakashi gestured towards the blonde. Now you blondie. Uzumaki Naruto. I like training, ramen and people that I'm close to. I dislike judgmental people and wasting time. My hobby is training and my dream is none of your business. Kakashi bit back another sigh. So I'm stuck with a wannabe Avenger, his fangirl and a hard with a chip on his shoulder. Great. Meet me tomorrow in training ground 7 at 6 in the morning for your genin test. And don't eat breakfast, or you'll puke. Sasuke and Sakura looked surprised, while Naruto just narrowed his eyes in suspicion, as he had seen genin who had already graduated returning to the academy every year. But sensei, we've already graduated from our genin exam. Sakura protested. Oh well you see that was only to rule out the really hopeless cases. The real genin exam is administered by the Junin sensei and it has a 66% fail rate. Kakashi told them with obvious amusement, as he always liked to see the genin panic. Well in this case only Sakura looked panicked. Sasuke just looked determined and Naruto looked like he was considering something. See you tomorrow. Kakashi called out cheerfully and vanished before anything more could be said. Naruto walked towards his sleepy-looking teammates, feeling full of energy after a big, hearty breakfast. Thanks to his position among the criminal elements in Konoha, he had limited intelligence on some of the better-known ninja in the village, Kakashi being one of them. To the rest of the world, the man was known as an extremely powerful and dangerous high A-ranked ninja. In Konoha he was most well known for being late to everything and reading porn anywhere and anytime. His good mood was instantly broken by a loud banshee war cry. You're late. Naruto looked at the irritated pink howler with a deadpan look. If I'm late then where is our sensei? Sakura looked a bit confused at that but still tried to argue her point. That's not the point, you were supposed to be here 2 hours ago. Clearly if our sensei isn't here then I'm not late for anything worth being here. I'm not going to waste my time waiting around for someone who can't even stick to his own schedule. Naruto retorted and there was blissful silence after that. His words however proved to be false, as he still spent another 2 hours waiting for the man, but it was better than 4. Yo! Came the greeting from the chronically late Junin as he suddenly appeared, 2 hours after Naruto had arrived. You're late. Sakura yelled out. Well you see, I took a wrong turn on the road of life. Kakashi explained, with one of his signature eye smiles. Liar. Naruto couldn't help rolling his eyes at the girl. She really needed to learn some volume control. Well now that we're all here, we can get started with the exam. Having said that, Kakashi pulled out 2 bells. Your job is to get these bells from me. Whoever gets a bell, passes and whoever doesn't, will get tied to the post over there while the others eat lunch in front of them and then get sent back to the academy. When this alarm clock rings, the test is over and I'll decide whether you pass or not. After he finished saying that, Kakashi took out an alarm clock and set it down on a nearby rock. 2 stomachs growled loudly when they heard this. Everyone looked towards Naruto who was looking perfectly fine. Didn't I tell you not to eat breakfast? Kakashi questioned with an eye smile. You did, and I ignored you. Naruto answered blandly. Well at least one of you knows better than to listen to stupid orders. Kakashi said with a sigh. Both Sakura and Sasuke looked upset over this. Sakura was especially hungry since she had also skipped dinner the previous night. Alright, time to get started, make sure to come at me with intent to kill or you won't succeed. Sasuke and Sakura immediately ran towards cover to hide themselves, but Naruto stayed where he was, intently observing the one-eyed Junin. Aren't you going to hide Naruto? Kakashi questioned while pulling out his book. Nah, I was thinking of trying to fight you head-on first. Kakashi still had his nose firmly planted in his book as he opened his mouth to say something, but was cut off by Naruto's sudden charge. The speed of it caught him off guard. The blonde was a lot faster than any genin had a right to be. Kakashi almost got hit, but managed to leap back just in time, pocketing his book at the same time, knowing that there was no way he'd be able to read if the blonde was this fast. He kept his eye firmly fixed on the blonde in front of him, wary of any further attacks, which was why he was badly startled to suddenly feel another set of arms, much too big to be Sasuke or Sakura, clamp themselves around his chest, pinning his arms to the side of his body. He tried to break free, but came to the unpleasant realization that the blonde was a good deal stronger than him. He used the kawarimi substitution just in time to prevent himself from getting stabbed by a kunai from the clone. Now wary of any further tricks, Kakashi was very certain that the Academy reports on Naruto were a load of crap. Naruto had sent a clone to wait for him while the real one hid nearby just in case he would need to have a devious trick prepared. If he was really a dead last like the reports claimed, then he would have just charged in and spammed clones, hoping to overwhelm him. Naruto, however, had no particular intention of using any further tricks. What he really wanted was to test himself against a Junin, to see how he measured up. With that in mind, he dispelled the clone and charged at the Cyclopean Junin and engaged him in a fast-paced taijutsu battle. Kakashi could clearly see that Naruto had no style, aside from a sort of freeform brawling. In spite of that, he was still strong and fast enough that it made him dangerous. Fortunately not dangerous enough to warrant revealing his Sharingan. Kakashi would have never lived it down if a freshly graduated genin had forced him to go that far. But he had left an obvious vulnerability aside from the holes in his style that Kakashi intended to point out to him before it got him killed on a mission. Dodging around a punch, he grabbed the long ponytail and yanked on it, kunai already in hand, ready to be pressed against the blonde's throat and force a surrender. He felt the surge of chakra going through the hair just in time to let go as the ponytail suddenly sprouted vicious spikes that would have mangled his hand badly if he'd kept hold of it. Apparently the ponytail was less of a vulnerability and more of a trap. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. In their respective hiding spots, both Sasuke and Sakura were watching with considerable disbelief at how much trouble their supposedly dead last teammate was causing their sensei. In spite of the fact that Naruto had never actually lost a taijutsu spar in the academy, nobody had ever really taken him seriously. Most of the teachers went out of their way to belittle him and he didn't even show up most of the time. They'd all taken the fact that he was so much older than them as a sign that he was too much of a loser to graduate with people his own age, but clearly there was more to it than that. Sasuke snapped out of his shock enough to take advantage of the situation, throwing several shuriken at the occupied Junin, hoping to get in a cheap shot. He was not going to be shown up by anyone. For a moment it seemed to have worked, as Kakashi was struck by the flying projectiles, but a few seconds later it was revealed to be just another kawarimi, as Kakashi was suddenly replaced by a log. Naruto bared his teeth in irritation at having his fight intruded upon, but he had to admit that he hadn't been getting anywhere, as the Junin was simply too fast and too experienced to be brought down by something that straightforward. Seeing that the Junin had pulled a vanishing act on them, Naruto sped into cover, knowing that staying out in the open and waiting for a superior opponent to attack was stupid. Less than a minute later he heard a horrified female screaming. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. In a nearby clearing, once again with book in hand, Kakashi was going over the short fight in his head. He had to admit that he was surprised by the blonde. He'd suspected that there was more to him than the academy had reported, but this was way beyond what he'd imagined. Naruto had clearly been doing some serious training to have gotten that strong and fast, and judging by how muscled his body was, he'd done most of it without chakra enhancement. Most shinobi didn't bother with that kind of training, since chakra enhancement was a lot faster, but Naruto was apparently dead set on squeezing out any advantage he could get. Kakashi just hoped he wouldn't develop a fondness of bowl cuts and green spandex. He was sorely disappointed in Sakura though. She was just as useless as he'd feared, a fangirl daydreaming about being saved by her crush. How she became top kunoichi was completely beyond Kakashi's understanding. He had been mildly surprised by the fact that Sasuke had actually worked with someone instead of trying to go at it alone. He was sadly not surprised at all to see the Uchiha come out of cover all alone, looking determined to take him head on, even though he'd already seen that it wasn't going to work. XXXXXXXXXXXXXX. While this was happening, Naruto was thinking over the situation. The whole thing was suspicious. He had seen a few genin cells going around the village before, and he had never seen them have anything less than 3 members and a Junin sensei. Added to this was the fact that Kakashi had already displayed a tendency to use deception with his order not to eat breakfast. Seeing as he had already failed to accomplish anything against the one-eyed Junin, and he had just now seen Sasuke get buried up to his neck in the dirt, it clearly showed that the man was not even fighting them seriously. Naruto also hadn't used his chakra chains or the Rasenjari, but he didn't think it would matter in the end, and he wasn't going to reveal those without a damn good reason. Considering that Kakashi ordered them not to eat breakfast as a test of whether they would blindly follow orders or not, he was guessing that the bells had a similarly hidden purpose. Clearly they were meant to pit them against each other, but Naruto was going to gamble on the chance that they were being tested if they could work together despite the seeming pointlessness of it. At least, he would attempt to work with Sasuke. Sakura was a non-entity in a fight and wouldn't be useful as anything but cannon fodder at this point. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Kakashi watched with interest as Naruto dug Sasuke out of the ground, and a short conversation ensued. He was too far to hear them and at the wrong angle to lip read, but it seemed that Naruto was proposing a plan of action and Sasuke was reluctantly accepting it, though he looked like he'd just been forced to swallow a. Maybe this team would actually pass the test. They were certainly showing a lot more promise than the teams he'd failed so far. Maybe it would even snap Sakura out of her fangirlishness, though he wasn't going to hold his breath on that one. Previous experience had taught him that fangirls could be pretty damned stubborn. XXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto and Sasuke were now making their way towards the clearing where Kakashi was waiting for their next attempt. Neither one of them was happy about working together, but both of them were clearly outmatched and neither had any better ideas for passing the test. Both of them, however, were in perfect agreement about Sakura. Naruto still wasn't willing to reveal anything more about his abilities, so their plan more or less hinged on shadow clones, the one fire jutsu that Sasuke knew, in a joint attack. As they approached Kakashi, the Junin spoke to them, despite having his face buried in a book again. Decided to work together, have you? Might as well give it a shot. Naruto shrugged and attacked, with Sasuke following not far behind. Though he didn't show it, Kakashi was impressed that they had actually decided to work together. Their teamwork sucked and they got in each other's way just as much as they helped each other, but it was more than any team he'd been given before had done, though he was wondering where Sakura was. The fight had settled into a pattern of Naruto keeping pressure on him in close quarters, with Sasuke taking attacks of opportunity every time he could, using kunai and shuriken to distract him from his fight with the blonde. The occasional shadow clone that joined in made sure that he never got too much breathing room. Kakashi wasn't going all out, of course, as he was only using taijutsu, but he was interested if they would try something else soon. Sasuke had dispelled several shadow clones when he hit them by accident, either because the clone had stepped into the path of a weapon or due to bad timing on a throw. Both of them were annoyed whenever the other screwed up, but they had managed to improve considerably during the course of the fight, their timing good enough that they became more dangerous to their prospective sensei rather than to each other. The combat dynamic suddenly shifted as Kakashi was attacked by 3 shadow clones at once along with the original, and Sasuke began making hand seals for the Kaden Gokaku no Jutsu Great Fireball Technique. The strategy was decent and would have worked on many Chunin-level ninja, but it never got off the ground due to the intervention of Sakura. She had woken up from her illusion-induced unconsciousness and had immediately rushed off towards the sounds of battle in a panic to determine if her precious Sasuke-kun was alright. Seeing that he was fine and working alongside the towering blonde against their prospective sensei, she decided to join in, hoping that Sasuke would be impressed. Unnoticed by everyone, she had rushed towards the Junin just as Naruto and Sasuke started their strategy to torch the Junin. Her aim with thrown weapons was pretty bad, which is why she rushed in very close before letting loose a kunai. Unfortunately, Her kunai sank into the back of a clone who had just moved to block a possible escape route, dispelling it and allowing Kakashi a clear avenue of escape. Kakashi took full advantage of this, grabbing Sakura around the neck and using her as a hostage, forcing Sasuke to abort his use of the fire jutsu. He may not have liked Sakura, but he didn't want to set her on fire. Everyone froze with sudden indecision while Kakashi looked on lazily, curious to see what they'd do now. Before any kind of further action could be taken, however, the silence was broken by the loud ringing of an alarm clock, signaling the end of the test. Well, it looks like the test is over and you failed to get the bells despite working together. Considering all this, I have no choice but to. Kakashi trailed off ominously, making all three of them tense. Pass you all, he finished brightly, complete with a smile. Sasuke and Sakura looked shocked, while Naruto just nodded to himself, his suspicion confirmed. Well, I guess none of you are getting tied to the post since you all seem to have figured out that the point of the test was teamwork. I left you 3 lunch boxes at the alarm clock, so enjoy and meet me here tomorrow at 8 in the morning. The Junin continued, I smile still in place, and then vanished from the training field, letting go of Sakura in the process. 20 minutes later, they had finished eating and were just about to head home when Sakura felt that she needed to say something that had been going through her head ever since Kakashi had passed them. Guys, I'm really sorry I got in your way at the end there. She spoke apologetically. That's alright, Sakura, I'm not disappointed in you at all. Naruto spoke kindly. Sasuke looked incredulous, since he was in fact pissed at her, and Sakura had a relieved and grateful look on her face, happy that her intimidating blonde teammate was actually a lot nicer than his appearance would suggest and that he wasn't angry at her for messing up. All of that was shattered as Naruto suddenly pointed his finger at her, his sharp teeth bared ferociously and eyes narrowed in a glare. I'm not disappointed, because I expected you to be completely useless from the start. Sasuke face faulted in surprise and Sakura had her jaw hanging in shock at the sudden turnaround from kind to brutal. What? She shrieked, unable to wrap her head around the situation. You're a wimp and you spend all your time fawning over Sasuke instead of training. If you want to be a cheerleader, then quit being a ninja, find some pom-poms, put on a short skirt and flash your panties at him as a civilian. Naruto continued to tear into her. How dare you? I'm just as much a part of this team as you, and I was top kunoichi while you were just a dead last for the past 4 years. Sakura shouted at him, her face burning with anger and humiliation. Sasuke was just standing at the side, watching the spectacle with interest. What you were in the academy doesn't mean shit in the real world. If you don't get your shit together, then you're gonna end up separated from your team one day, without backup and forced to rely on yourself. When that happens, not if but when, because it will happen eventually, and you haven't trained hard enough to fight your way out of that situation, the best you can hope for is a quick death. If you're really unlucky, then you'll get captured and some sick is going to use you as his personal plaything until he gets bored. Naruto ripped apart her argument mercilessly. Not waiting for her to reply, Naruto left the training field, leaving his teammates gaping like fish. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. The very first thing that Naruto did with his newly confirmed genin status was head to the library. The librarian tried to prevent him entry, but a dark scowl and a glare quickly made her shut up. He'd made a reputation of not taking any shit from anyone in the past few years, and the civilians found that they didn't have the guts to antagonize him now that he wasn't a helpless child anymore. Moving to the section of the library that was reserved for things that genin-level ninja were allowed access to, Naruto was unsurprised to find it completely empty. Most genin never even knew that they had access to basic training techniques in the library and didn't need to rely on their sensei for everything. In fact, most genin didn't even know there was a library available to them, thinking that their sensei was supposed to teach them everything. Usually people only figured this out once they made chunin and suddenly found themselves lacking a constant sensei. Sending out clones to investigate the various parts of the library, Naruto searched around for about an hour before concluding that there wasn't all that much of interest to be found. One of his clones found scrolls on surface clinging and water walking, which he intended to master as soon as possible. More chakra control and different ways to use it was always a good thing. Aside from that, there were only a few basics on the subject of genjutsu and ninjutsu, along with a few D-rank techniques, which he would never be capable of performing. All of these techniques stressed the importance of properly controlling one's chakra, and though his control was good considering his reserves, in comparison to what most people consider good control, it was terrible. He would either waste hundreds times more chakra than needed, or more likely, the techniques would blow up in his face or not work at all. The only thing of greater interest was another book on fuinjutsu. Finished with his inspection of the library, he had a group of clones copy the scrolls with the chakra control exercises and what little information there was about the generalities of genjutsu and ninjutsu. The fuinjutsu book he intended to check out and copy at home. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto was making his way home, deep in thought about how to further progress in his training. He still had to figure out what to do with wind and water manipulation, as there had been nothing much on the subject in the library to his disappointment. Sure, there were a few jutsu on the subject, but considering that most ninja in Konoha were fire-natured, very few, and he couldn't use them anyway, so he was back so square one. He had managed to do a few things with water manipulation by charging his chakra into a pool of water and controlling it. It had some promising implications, but until he learned more about nature manipulation, it was likely going to be nothing more useful than harmless splashing in the water. Attempting the same thing with wind had yielded nothing more than a refreshing breeze, and while that was useful on hot days or creating a dramatic wind when you were striking a cool pose, it was utterly useless for combat. He remained deep in thought as he turned a corner and bumped into a distinctly female figure. Instinctively reaching out before she could fall to the ground, he pulled her to his chest. "Na Naruto," she squeaked in surprise. "Kasumi, what are you doing here?" Naruto asked in surprise. Kasumi was one of the girls who had used the money he sent them to get out of the life of a prostitute. She, along with two of her friends, had pooled their money together and bought out a clothing store from an old woman whose business had been declining for years. The fact that the old woman was one of those who had charged him extra or thrown him out when he tried to shop there in his youth had nothing at all to do with her failing business. Nothing at all. All three young women had moved into an apartment above their new store, which was why Naruto was surprised to run into her. "Oh, I was just visiting Keiko. She made me promise to visit when we left," Kasumi explained. "Ah yes, Keiko would be quite upset if you didn't visit," Naruto muttered, remembering the girl in question. Keiko was one of those women who actually worked in a brothel by choice. Despite her occupation, she actually slept with very few men, or women for that matter. At first glance this would seem to be very odd, as Keiko came across as a very sweet girl with beautiful black hair and alluring black eyes in her late 20s that always had a smile on her face, leaving many clients baffled as to why the matron in charge of the brothel only directed a rare few clients her way. Those who knew her better, however, understood perfectly, as Keiko had a perverted streak a mile wide and 2 miles deep. Any client sent her way usually ended up chained to a wall or to the ceiling after Keiko drugged them on the way to the dungeon that was built into the basement of the building. Clients were provided with a safe word before being introduced to Keiko. Naruto had gotten a reputation among the brothels by the time he'd been introduced to Keiko, and the matron had known of his bizarre reason as to why he had suddenly become a regular. Keeping this in mind, the woman reasoned that he didn't need a safe word if he was trying to learn as much about pleasing a woman as possible. When Naruto had woken up to find himself, arms chained to the ceiling and feet to the floor, with Keiko standing in front of him in a highly revealing leather outfit, complete with whip, he had no idea what to think. For the next few hours, the woman had proceeded to cause a mix of pleasure and pain on the blonde, sometimes both at the same time, until he didn't know whether to kill the matron or thank her. Keiko had absolutely ignored him every time he told her to stop, until she had her sadistic streak satisfied. After she had released him, she had demanded that he tie her up and pay her back, which Naruto had ironically found even more difficult than enduring her attentions before that. When questioned, she told him that she only submitted to those who could take everything that she did to them, and since Naruto hadn't been given a safe word, he had no choice but to take it. Things that Naruto had never even considered doing to women, Keiko had wanted. His face had been on fire with embarrassment at the things she told him to do, each worse than the other. Naruto had never imagined that any woman could be this much of a pervert before. He hadn't thought anyone could be this much of a pervert. She had excitedly handed him a wooden paddle, bent over and told him to spank her, jiggling her bear enthusiastically, and then pouted when he didn't hit hard enough. She'd only told him to stop once her was glowing red and her juices were leaking down her legs from her arousal. Then she'd promptly gone down on her knees and told him to stick his down her throat until she choked. Naruto's confused mind had been desperately trying to figure out what the right thing to do was, torn between Kiko's clear excitement over being treated so roughly and his belief that women should be treated gently. In the end, the perverted woman had looked so upset that he didn't seem to want to play, as she put it, that he had pushed aside his confusion and did as she asked, even though it felt wrong to him the entire time. It had gotten especially bad for him when her desires started going into territory that left visible damage on her body, but her excited yells and moans told him that she was enjoying even that, somehow. She'd been especially happy when she'd seen how sharp his teeth were. Would you like to come over for some tea? Kasumi asked with a blush on her face, breaking him out of his thoughts. That sounds nice, but I've just passed my genin test and I've got a lot to do. Naruto deflected awkwardly. He had a good idea what Kasumi was really after, and he'd avoided sleeping with women for a while now. He didn't feel that it was right to keep sleeping with them anymore. It had been bad enough when he'd done it for practice, but to keep having with all of them even after felt like he was betraying Xana, even though she didn't see it that way. Kasumi was a beautiful young woman in her mid to late 20s with shiny light brown hair and dark brown eyes. Curvy, with a cheerful attitude, especially now that she didn't have to work in a brothel anymore, she was definitely very attractive, and Naruto felt himself getting hard at the obvious offer she was making, but it just didn't feel right to him to accept offers like this anymore. Oh, that's great, congratulations. Now you definitely have to come over. I can call Aiko and Tasuki and we can celebrate together. I'm sure they'll be just as thrilled as me. Kasumi persisted, her blush fiercer than ever and discreetly rubbing her thighs together. Naruto swallowed nervously at what was being offered to him, his pants now painfully tight. He knew perfectly well that Kasumi was right and that Aiko and Tasuki, Kasumi's roommates, would in fact be all for the idea of sharing him. They had done it before after all. But he really was trying to stop sticking his into every woman he came across. He'd only done it because Xana had all but ordered him to practice, and after the last time the demoness had made an advance on him, she had seemed very pleased, which was why he'd figured it was time to stop. That sounds great, Kasumi, but I really don't have time right now. I've got training to do and techniques I need to study. He reasoned, with a nervous drop of sweat rolling down his face, hoping that she wouldn't press him any further. He really wasn't sure how long he could keep resisting that kind of offer, especially as he knew that Xana wouldn't really care. Kasumi sighed and gave a disappointed pout, but not at all the same. Alright, some other time then. Naruto sighed in relief before saying goodbye and making his way back to his apartment, intending to take a very cold shower. He completely missed the devious smile that spread across Kasumi's face. Genin, huh? That means that he'll be doing D-ranked missions for a while. A plan already forming, she made her way home to talk to her roommates about hiring a team of genin to help sort that new shipment of clothes that was going to be arriving in 2 days. If she had her way, then the only clothes Naruto would be sorting were the ones that she, Tasuki and Aiko would be wearing that day. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto stepped out of the shower, getting goosebumps from stepping out of a cold shower into the open air. Standing in front of the mirror, he opened his mouth and took a look at his teeth. Instead of the blunt teeth that would be normal for humans, he saw a mouth full of razors, with only a few teeth being blunt. The canines in particular stood out, being the longest and sharpest, with the 4 teeth between them looking somewhat more normal, though still sharper than average, and all the teeth at the side being fanged, though not to the same extent as the canines. His lower teeth had a similar situation, being almost entirely fanged and dangerous looking. People who didn't know him found it extremely disturbing when he grinned at them, especially if he was angry. He strongly suspected that Xana had a hand in making his teeth the way they were. Despite how menacing they made him look, people who knew him weren't bothered by it. Many of the women that he'd been with had actually liked them, saying that it gave him even more of an animal magnetism than his whisker marks. Naruto liked them too, but he really needed to ask Xana about them one day, since he was curious as to why she'd done this. With only a towel wrapped around his hips, he made his way towards his bedroom, as he hadn't bothered to bring any fresh clothes to the bathroom with him. As he passed through the living room, he stopped as he saw Xana lounging in a cushioned easy chair, somehow making it look like a throne. "Hello Naruto, congratulations on finally making Genin." The demoness congratulated, simultaneously making a subtle jab at his long run as dead last. She was fully aware that it couldn't be helped, but mocked him for it anyway. Naruto ignored the jab, knowing that she was only trying to get a rise out of him. The subject of his teeth was still on his mind, and he figured that this was as good a time as any to ask. "Thanks Xana, it means a lot to me that you'd come to congratulate me," he said sincerely. "I'm actually glad you're here for another reason too." "Oh," she arched a fiery eyebrow in interest. "I wanted to ask you about my teeth," he explained. "They are very nice teeth, yes, what about them?" the demoness asked with a smile that showed her own sharp teeth. "I was wondering if you made my teeth like this deliberately, or was it a side effect of being sealed in me?" "It was deliberate, of course, along with your whisker marks. I thought they suited you," she admitted freely, curious about his reaction. She knew most people would be upset, but Naruto had proven that he was not most people many times already. "Great, thanks for that, I really like both the teeth and the whisker marks," he said with a wide grin that showed of those very teeth. Xana could only give an amused smile at her favorite human. He was the most interesting thing she'd encountered in longer than she cared to remember. He eagerly threw himself into a task that anyone else would say was impossible. He was glad that she had made changes to his body that most would dislike. He completely invalidated his father's sacrifice by releasing her from the seal, to name just a few. That last one was of particular note. The soul of the Yondaime was now trapped forever in the stomach of the death god, and it was completely pointless. Oh sure, she wasn't going to destroy the village anytime soon, but she hadn't intended to do that when she'd attacked 17 years ago either, and she considered her warning delivered even if nobody had wanted to listen to it. She imagined that the look on the Yondaime's face if he ever learned that his son had made it his goal in life to marry the demon he'd imprisoned would be a sight for the ages. "Well, I have also come here for a reason aside from offering congratulations," Xana said sensually as she slowly made her way across the room. She was wearing a red dress that seemed to be more a collection of straps that covered her and private parts and swayed with her movements in such a way that it just barely remained decent. It was exceedingly obvious that she was not wearing underwear, not that this was unusual for her. "What reason would that be?" Naruto asked, doing his very best to keep his skyrocketing arousal out of his voice. A task that was doomed to failure as the towel around his hips began rising, utterly insufficient to conceal his hardening member. "Lust is an interesting thing," she spoke as she trailed a finger across his pectorals while making her way around him until she stood behind him, pressed against his back and her crotch pressed against his right thigh. Like anger, it is a powerful impulse. Anger can give you strength, keep you warm, drive you, allow you to push aside pain. But if one surrenders to their anger completely, then they are made blind and stupid, ignoring danger in favor of lashing out against the source of their anger. Xana continued to speak hypnotically while trailing her hands down his chest and stomach, slowly making her way beneath the towel. Naruto was struggling to pay attention to what she was saying instead of thoughts of how much he wanted to grab her and throw her on the bed, especially as he could now feel the trickle of her own fluids going down his leg, clearly showing that she was just as aroused as him. Her hand just reached his testicles and began to fondle them gently when she continued speaking. You humans seem to think that lust is something to be ashamed of. You hide it so desperately as if it were some terrible secret. But lust too can be used, both your own and that of others. Naruto began breathing harder as her hand moved to his now 9-inch and fully erect member, stroking it slowly. Inspire the lust of others and their thoughts will be clouded, their minds slow and clumsy as their own desires constantly interfere with their thinking. Know your own lust and learn to use it, and this cannot be used against you. There is neither shame nor betrayal in lusting after the bodies of others as long as your soul remains devoted. Naruto by this point was finding it damn near impossible to focus and understood what she meant by lust making thoughts clouded. Her voice in his ear was an enchanting melody, passing through his mind, and her hand setting his loins on fire was leaving him glassy-eyed as he continued to listen dazedly. To succumb to lust completely and becoming a rapist shows shameful weakness of spirit, but to able to act on your desires without forcing yourself on others is a strength. To take every step in confidence without feeling shame in your own nature is a strength that very few humans ever achieve. Demons so easily give in to their impulses, becoming mindless monsters, and humans repress them, becoming weak-willed sheep. To stand in the middle, taking strength from your nature, but using it instead of being used by it, that is a great power, the mastery of the self. Naruto could feel himself getting close to a climax. The towel had long since fallen to the floor and he was ready to spray his own living room white any second now. Moments away from orgasm, the hand suddenly stopped. Well, I know that you have training to do and techniques to study, so I won't take away any more of your time. Came a voice that Naruto would forevermore swear was the epitome of cruelty, but was in fact amusement, before Xana suddenly vanished. Naruto collapsed to his knees as his balls contracted and began to painfully protest the sudden lack of female hand. He stayed there for several minutes longer, hoping that his testicles would stop hurting soon. He now had an excruciatingly clear understanding about using other people's lust against them. He wondered absently if his balls were currently understanding anger and lashing out blindly. Regardless, he got the point that she had been making. Clearly she had been observing the incident with Kasumi and had seen both his desire and his refusal to act on it, as well as knowing his reasons for refusing Kasumi's offer. She had rather brutally, in his opinion, shown him that she would only care if another woman took her place in his heart, but as long as that didn't happen, she didn't care how many women he slept with, wanted him to even. He wasn't quite sure why exactly she kept pushing him to sleep with other women, but he was guessing that he was supposed to learn something. It was hardly the first time that she had tried to teach him something in a roundabout manner. Everything about this encounter had been done with a purpose. From the dress, to the way that her hard nipples had poked into his back and the juices she had been leaking over his leg the entire time. She had used his lust for her and turned him into a drooling idiot, metaphorically speaking, all the while fully in control of her own desire, using it to drive him crazy, leaving him completely blind to the oddity of getting a lecture and a handjob at the same time. XXXXXXXXXX. 2 days later, Team 7 was in front of the Hokage, waiting to receive a new mission. After the disappointment of having a mission to collect garbage yesterday, they weren't overly enthusiastic about missions anymore. The Sandaime Hokage himself, Sarutobi Hiruzen, looked over Team 7 and felt the old sadness when looking at the tallest of them, Uzumaki Naruto. The blonde had always been smarter than his age would make you think. When he had still been a child, the boy had sometimes asked him why the village hated him so much, and Sarutobi had been unable to give a proper answer, but had urged him not to hate the villagers, as they were only acting out of ignorance. Naruto had gotten angry at him for making excuses for the village, and as he grew older became ever more distant to the Hokage despite Sarutobi's attempts to befriend him. As Hokage, it was the old man's job to protect the village, and Naruto apparently understood that, but that also meant that he had to protect people who had abused him, and the blonde instantly distrusted him because of that. It had gotten even worse when he had learned of the Kyuubi when he was 13 after the incident with Mizuki. Sarutobi had tried to explain that the Yondaime had sacrificed himself to protect the village from the rampage of a terrible demon, and that he had trusted that Naruto would be able to hold it back and keep the village safe. This had only further angered the blonde, demanding to know why they would hate him if he was protecting them, and Sarutobi had once again failed to provide an answer that would satisfy the blonde. After that, the blonde had matched the village glare for glare, and if any of them tried to raise their hand against him, he would strike back twice as viciously. His new attitude towards the village had not endeared him to the general population, but it certainly had caused them to back off. Sarutobi had only been told by Iruka of the tampering that the academy instructors had been doing with Naruto's grades, making him realize that this was yet another reason why Naruto didn't trust him, as the academy was under his direct control, but he had been too busy to take a thorough look at it, believing that Naruto was simply a poor student. Once he'd looked at the results himself, he could only conclude that Naruto should have been Rookie of the Year and graduated years ago. It was just a guess, as he didn't have the proper results for accuracy tests or taijutsu spars, but he was pretty sure that he was right. It was too late now to do anything about that, however. The damage was done, and revealing the truth was only going to rock the boat, and from what Kakashi had reported, Team 7 was rocky enough already. We have something special for Team 7 today. The Hokage began, looking at the mission scroll. Special how? Sakura questioned curiously. It could hardly be any worse than collecting garbage. Your team was specifically requested for this mission. To be more precise, the clients requested the team, with Uzumaki Naruto on it. Sarutobi explained to the bafflement of everyone present, as nobody could think of any reason for Naruto to be requested. Who are the clients? Naruto asked, wanting to get to the bottom of this. 3 women who own a clothing store have requested the help of your team with sorting a new shipment of clothes that has arrived today. Their names are Kasumi, Tasuki, and Aiko. Sarutobi revealed, making Naruto twitch imperceptibly at the reminder of his very bad case of blue balls 2 days ago. The others still looked confused. I take it you know these women, Naruto? Kakashi asked, noticing that Naruto seemed to know something. You could say that. Apparently they heard that I made genin and want to have someone familiar doing the mission. Naruto was pretty sure that his explanation was entirely wrong, and that what he would be doing was going to be a great deal different than what the rest of his team would be doing. After the conversation with Zana, Naruto had spent a lot of time thinking over her words and understood that she was trying to help him on his self-imposed mission to become stronger. Her help was not a direct increase of power or a technique that could be used. No, it was more abstract than that. She was trying to teach him that he was limiting himself by suppressing his own nature. It was ingrained in humans to hide things that may be seen as shameful in the eyes of the community, out of fear of rejection. This fear prevented people from acting in certain ways even if they wanted to, even if it would benefit them and harm no one. Naruto had a leg up on other people in discarding this fear, as the community had already rejected him and T.